I was asked to speak about the interface between screening and vaccination, and in fact, what I would like to be specifically talking about is mostly the rethinking of cervical cancer screening in the era of vaccination, which would be sort of like the secondary title for my presentation. This is my disclosure slide. Lots of things written there. Eventually, you can read it later. Particularly the creed here, what I have about my conflict of interest, but I have none. But these are my disclosures. So this is the top view outline of what I wanted to cover, discussing here with you. I think I'm preaching. I don't need to preach to the converted here. You all, starting from the basic premise that cervical cancer screening based on molecular HPV testing is already an unequivocal improvement over the paradigm of PEP cytology. So no need to belabor here on the arguments with respect to that. And but because of vaccination, it's been with us for about 13 years now, the rationale for changing screening from the cytological paradigm to molecular is much stronger now as we in the post-vaccination era. And there are a number of advantages integrating primary and secondary prevention processes, even though they apply to different groups of people and they're done by different stakeholders and actors in the process. But it does make sense to focus on that. And another thing that's important for us to keep in mind is that after a little over a decade, HPV vaccination has already begun to change how we understand the epidemiology of cervical precancer, particularly not yet cervical cancer, but it has already changed the epidemiology of precancer. So the question, this begs the question, how should screening be done in the future? So just going back several years, more than 15 years, in fact, when the IARC cervix cancer screening working group was convened in 2004 in Lyon, and the work group concluded that there was sufficient evidence that screening by conventional cytology has reduced cervical cancer incidence and mortality rates. But notice how it's extraordinary what the group concluded in 2004, that there is already, I'm saying present tense, but this was back in 2004, published in 2005, that there is sufficient evidence that testing for HPV infection as the primary screening modality, can reduce cervical cancer incidence and mortality rates. So that concept, that notion has been with us for quite a while, and that there has been a voluminous amount of evidence that has come to us after that. But that same working group also concluded the following, because in 2004 was the year, if you remember, the publication of the first phase 2b trial on HPV vaccination. So in the preamble of the working group, there was a clear statement with respect to the notable advance. The most important, and I'm just going to read off, the most important, the identification that certain oncogenic types of HPV as the major cause of cervical cancer. Indeed, it may be that disease does not occur in the absence of HPV infection. Then comes the conclusion, which is, of course, very relevant for how we conduct screening in this era. With the development of vaccine against these oncogenic HPV types, it's becoming possible to envisage the primary prevention of most cases of cervical cancer. So the IARC was already considerably keen on the elimination pathway. But it said it will be several decades, however, before most women in the relevant age groups will benefit from such vaccines, since they will already have been at risk of exposure to the virus. And this provides the backdrop for our conversation here, because we conduct both of them, and we know that doing one alone is not going to be sufficient. And in the landscape of screening right now, we have the following alternatives. And of course, I'm not going to be covering VIA and other technologies that exist out there, but I'm just going to mention the ones that are based on morphology, microscopic morphology, cytology, whether a liquid-based cytology or conventional. In the paradigm that began with the ALTS trial, for instance, in the United States, which eventually was adopted in many different countries, is cytology with ASCUS triage via HPV testing, a paradigm that's on the way out in Western countries. Co-testing, of course, as you know, is primarily done in the United States, and it is possibly also on the way out, because even the guidelines in the US and countries that have adopted that are beginning to embrace primary HPV testing, which is the third option here, which requires triage of HPV positive cases. And we heard a lot from speakers yesterday and today about that. And in high resource countries, cytology is one of the options we heard yesterday from the Netherlands. And also in the US, partial genotyping 16 and 18 with conditional cytology if it is not 16 and 18. Questions exist, and there is in the landscape variation between age start screening. 18 is on the way out. I don't think there's any country now doing 18, perhaps on an opportunistic basis. 21, 25, 30, and even 35, as we have seen. And questions about frequency of screening, every annual, also on the way out, every 2, every 3, every 5, and even longer periods of screening, particularly with molecular technologies. A big discussion yesterday, you heard from Talia Malagon about age to stop screening for cervical cancer. The various arguments for safety and the balance of harms and benefits and quality of life that come to women. Just one slide to preach to the converted here. You know, the evidence for HPV primary screening is overwhelming, and I don't think I need to belabor much on that. But there are a few bullet points here which are part of the arguments that I would like to retain for a discussion here. The protection against cervical adenocarcinoma is an important one relative to cytology. And given the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is COVID-19 pandemic, self-sampling, which was already a very reasonable option that was on the way in, now has been accelerated because the opportunity to empower women and also reduce disparities and increase screening rates, and effectively in some countries actually enable screening coverage altogether, because screening has been interrupted in many countries. Cytology, and another important argument is that cytology is less effective in a vaccinated population, and there's not only epidemiology 101 evidence to that, in the sense that the decrease in the prevalence of cervical precancer, decrease in the positive predictive value of cytology decreases as well as it would of any other test, but there has been, and this was the first one by Tim Palmer and colleagues, showing that indeed this is happening, empirical evidence that this is in fact the case. So when we look together the two approaches, both primary and secondary prevention of cervical cancer, it's instructive and it's helpful to put them in a particular layout here of how they work, and along the lines of the milestones in the natural history of cervical cancer. So from the early sexual exposure all the way to development of cervical cancer, you have a number of steps here in the causal pathway, and we have at our disposal primary prevention, which is HPV vaccination, which blocks this initial causal relation between sexual exposure to acquisition of HPV infection, which eventually leads, if uninterrupted, eventually leads, a persistent infection leads to a cancer precursor, which again, we have another opportunity to interrupt and arrest this process here via screening. So we have been living with this paradigm here for 70 years, and then we added this one here. And it's done by different actors, as you can see. Primary prevention, delivery is primarily during the pre-adolescence and the adolescence years, and management is done by different actors. There are national immunization programs, pediatric clinics, general practitioner clinics, and so on. Whereas secondary prevention is the delivery. It's a different point in the life cycle, in the life course, from early adulthood to mid to late 60s, whereas the actors are cancer control programs or the actual opportunistic primary care visit that we know exists. So these are different people, and they have been different people. And I'll make the point in the next slide of how there's an advantage via surveillance that to integrate this process for efficiency benefits and also for us to learn a little more. Another point I want to make out of this slide is the fact that as we choke this process here, there's less of that and less of that. So there's going to be the number of cancer precursors which we detect by screening and we arrest via treatment is going to fall to a trickle. So if you, using the analogy of a river going run into the ocean. Eventually, if you dam the beginning of the river here, the water flow decreases here. So, and this affects vaccination. This is the primary base why vaccination eventually affects the performance of screening and how we interpret that. So the point about integrating things has to do with the fact that we want to bring efficiency benefits. So what you're seeing here is an ideal world of a rationale for how we would integrate vaccination and screening programs. And of course, this implies high resource settings, because as you can see here, the resources that are described in this slide imply this core. The square here shows a core generic screening program centered on HPV screening with triage based on either cytology or genotyping. And eventually from this particular core screening program, which would also serve as a surveillance, the core component of a surveillance mechanism, linked to registry of HPV outcomes, other healthcare databases such as clinical data sets, a cytology and pathology registry, also connected to a population-based tumor registry. Eventually, we would have the means whereby we're feeding also this process here with HPV vaccination, or a registry of those who were vaccinated would have the means to conduct surveillance very effectively, such as population effectiveness of both vaccination and screening, measure duration of protection with vaccines, cross-protection as vaccines are added from valence of vaccines change in the population, the opportunity to monitor type replacement, and inequalities, particularly to look at inequity in the system in general. So these are that's the rationale for eventually speaking in favor of integrating resources for surveillance, and other people have spoken very eloquently about this, such as Cosette Wheeler and others. Now we have the new mantra now in front of us, which is the road to elimination, but there's a number of things that we need to consider in that process, in addition to everything else that has been discussed in this meeting. We know that vaccination has reduced already the incidence and prevalence of cervical precancers caused by HPV. This, of course, in consequence, is going to have an impact on screening performance and practice, and that ultimately will shift the balance of benefits to harms in screening. So the questions that are before us, and many people have contemplated that: can screening begin later in life, be done less frequently, and be stopped earlier in populations with high vaccination coverage? And this question has been contemplated over and over in the past 13 years by various guidelines. Also the question of individualizing management, such as policies differing between vaccinated and unvaccinated women. And modeling, which was done in particular in connection with the latest U.S. Preventive Service Task Force, has shown that combining vaccination and screening is cost effective, and it is good value for money. But screening would have to start much later in life, and here are the examples that were done in these publications. So there is a sense that maintaining high frequency of screening during vaccination is somewhat wasteful of resources and potentially could cause harm. And the evidence for causing harm may come from evidence that was shown by Fiucaso and colleagues that lesion management guidelines, they need to be relaxed. Risk of cervical precancer post a low-grade lesion is lower among vaccinated than among unvaccinated individuals. So we continue on. Many different guidelines in the past 10 years have revisited the whole concept of cancer screening, and they have gradually favored the molecular testing. You may remember the huge consortium of the SCCP, SCP, and ACS in 2012, which was coordinated more or less with the U.S. Preventive Service Task Force, and both published in 2012, and introducing in the United States co-testing. ASCO in 2016 for the global oncology view of cervical cancer prevention favored HPV testing, and last year the SCP put HPV front and center, and so did the American Cancer Society this year. The European guidelines of 2015 have also gradually, and if you look at country guidelines, they have gradually also favored that. However, except for Italy, And Francesca Carozzi here is the author of the paper I'm going to show next. Countries are opting for one-size-fits-all screening strategy, irrespective of vaccination history. And the reason may be many, because the countries may not be willing to decide on different policies or screening or management policies to reflect vaccination status, because we don't have enough evidence at this point or trust in the record on the history, clinical history that would have for a woman. Italy came up with a very clever algorithm to define how vaccination would affect screening frequency, and they devised this clever algorithm that I don't have time to go into the merit of this, and Francesca's here she could eventually comment on that. But that's, to my knowledge, that's the only country that has actually had the courage to actually move into that direction. So there is urgency to change the screening paradigm now, but how will screening perform in the future is an important question we need to know. And I submit to you that with high vaccination coverage, which hopefully we will achieve in all age cohorts, cross-protection, herd immunity, HPV transmission will be kept at bay. Molecular tests will eventually lose its clinical utility, and we don't have time to get into the merit for that, but we published the epidemiologic underpinnings for why this would be the case as well. When disease becomes so rare, even the idealized testing will become a problem. Cervical cancer screening is not devoid of immediate and long-term risks for women's cervical cancer and for women's reproductive health, which is a problem we need to keep in mind. And today, we know that these risks are outweighed by the benefits of screening. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, will that balance change in the future? And there's a way that we can know when screening could stop, eventually 30, 40 years, 50 years into the future. We need to reassess risk tolerance, which varies already among populations and will continue to be the case. Different populations have different tolerance for risk. We need to define benchmarks of what is acceptable in different populations. Countries may decide to phase out screening based on a consensus that perhaps we have already attained an acceptably low level of cervical cancer risk, below the 4 per 100,000 target of WHO. And we also could consider that the projected post-vaccination incidence cervical cancer, we could compare that with cancers for which screening is possible, or even standard practice. Look at also a case fatality and prognosis of different cancers. Let's take, for instance, vaginal and vulvar cancers, which both could be screened by cytology if we wanted. However, there's no policy for screening for those. I'm showing you SEER data. This is the age-specific incidence rates for various female cancers here. And this is in log scale here. Here's cervical cancer in this line here. And as you can see, just hovering above the 10 per 100,000 line. And you have vulvar cancer here, which beginning at age 75 exceeds, in fact, risk of cervical cancer. And we have vaginal cancer here, much lower than both. And if we look at the case fatality from the survival perspective here, we see that these same cancers have, in the case of vulvar cancer, more or less comparable survival as cervical cancer, whereas vaginal cancer has a much worse survival, in fact. So these are more severe disease than cervical cancer, and yet we do not screen for them. So we're happy in terms of accepting risk for these diseases without doing any secondary screening for that. And that's my last slide. These are some conclusions that we can take at face value now, and they're conjectures for the future here. Incorporation of molecular HPV testing is no longer questioned as the way forward, and I think you all agree with that. There are challenges, and we heard a lot about them yesterday and today about implementing these technologies. And the fact that the decline in the prevalence of cervical lesions will eventually affect this relation between benefits to harms from screening, and we need to be vigilant with respect to that. I just showed you one way that we can establish a benchmark of what we can tolerate a risk by analogy with other cancers. And eventually, of course, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will empower women via self-sampling, and that's a great solution that many of you are contemplating, and we heard great talks in this conference. And that's what I wanted to leave with you. Thank you very much, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.